Well, thank you all. Welcome to Neal, and I want to jump right into the conversation. I'll start by saying that this piece, which I think may be being shown behind us, but if it's not, we published this officially only a week ago yesterday, and it's already garnered 100 plus as of this morning. I think 103,000 likes on Facebook, which is always suggestive of an article that is resonating widely. And it was an incredibly brave. Actually, let me start by pointing out one other thing, which is that Neal, for this occasion, has used a pocket square that has change on it. So very appropriate.
Reflects my financial circumstances.
Yeah, that as well. But you talk. I mean, the title is the shame, or you talk about the shame quality of discussing finances, and you talk about how people are actually more likely, Americans are more likely, and particularly American men, are more willing to talk about their erectile dysfunction than they are about their financial circumstances. So I guess two questions. One is, what prompted you to overcome your own shame, to very bravely come forward and talk about this in a way that has resonated very widely? And then we'll get into, explore this at some length, but what's the response been?
I'm either brave or very foolish, but what prompted me was this. I mean, I've had financial difficulties almost all my life. You wouldn't know it if you to look at me or to look at my resume or to look at my 1040. But when I read the Fed survey of household economics last year, one statistic popped out at me, and that was that they asked, if you had a $400 emergency, would you have the $400 to pay off that emergency? Now, I knew my own circumstances, and frequently I wouldn't have $400, but I assumed I was in an extremely small minority. And the statistic was 47% of Americans, 47% would not have $400 of liquid assets in their checking account or whatever to pay off that $400. And that, astonished me. And what prompted me to write this piece, if you know my work, you know I almost never write personal pieces. I write about culture, I write about Hollywood, I write about politics, but I never write about myself. But I thought perhaps I can make some small contribution to those individuals out there who are suffering as I'm suffering, but suffer silently. And I'll just tell you one thing. I'm getting a lot of emails. People are actually seeking out my email address, which is not the easiest thing in the world to do, as you know from your own emails. I'm getting a lot of emails, but I got one last night in particular. People were telling me their stories, but I got one in particular that seemed to summarize exactly why I wrote the piece, and it was extremely gratifying to me. It just said, "Thank you, thank you, thank you. Now I know I am not alone."
Well, I want to talk more about the response, and I should say that the preface is by saying that the bulk of the response that we've published online in our notes section on theatlantic.com has been enormously positive. A lot of people sharing their comparable stories, some of which are quite moving, affecting. Comment sections are always a swamp of negativity and awfulness. So I want to get to the positive stuff, and then I want to get to what this means for the state of the larger economy. But first, the main criticism I understand, and I've avoided wading into the comments, but one criticism that we sort of knew we'd get was, you're crying poverty, and yet you're living. You've made certain choices. Yeah. You live on Long Island. You have a professional class life. You claim you're not trying to keep up with the Joneses, and yet. No. You're living legitimately hand to mouth, but there is stipulating that there are 47% of Americans who can't afford to make ends meet month to month. There are ones like you who are living a middle or upper middle class lifestyle and have that milieu, and then those who are not.
Well, I would disagree with you. I think I'm living a middle class lifestyle, possibly a modern middle class lifestyle. One of the statistics that I cite in the piece, which was another thing that astonished me, is that several years ago, USA Today did a study of what it would cost to live a middle-class existence. Now, they leveled it out geographically because there's clearly a difference between living in New York and living in Iowa. But they used what we would generally consider to be the kind of benchmarks of a middle-class existence: a $250,000 home, a yearly vacation, an automobile, sending your children to college, paying your medical expenses. And what they determined was that a middle-class existence, using those kinds of benchmarks, a middle-class existence would cost $130,000. And we know that 1 in 8 Americans make $130,000. So when you say I'm living a middle-class existence, I'm not living a middle-class existence by that standard. I drive a 1997 Toyota Avalon with 160,000 miles that I inherited from my father. We never go out to eat. I say these things in the piece, and they're all true. I'm a film critic, but I seldom go to movies anymore. We never take a vacation, and I mean never. We haven't taken a vacation. In the piece, I say 10 years, but it's probably closer to 15. We live a very frugal existence. We didn't live extravagantly before, and we certainly don't live extravagantly now. You know, I may live in the Hamptons, but I live in the Hamptons full-time like the poor people, and those of you who know that community know of where I speak. I don't live there during the summer like the rich people. There are 2 Hamptons. Hamptons are basically a colony, just like Africa. You know, I mean, basically, you've got the rich people who come in and live, you know, are served by the poor people. I'm not in the service community, I'm a writer, but basically I'm part of that full-time lower end. And if you were to see my house or you see my circumstances, no one who saw that would ever say, boy, this guy is living high on the hog and he simply blew through a wad of money. I know that there have been people who've said that. They didn't read the piece carefully enough. Yeah, I blew through some money because I had to send my kids to college. You know, I had to pay my medical insurance because I'm a writer, and it's not paid by the people who employ me to write articles. I had to pay gigantic taxes because I get paid advances that are fairly significant, but have to be amortized over a number of years. But the federal government no longer has income averaging. So they take a gigantic bite of my money and then expect me to have that money last me for the 6, 7, or 8 years that it takes me to write a book. So, you know, these are the kinds of circumstances that get not only me, we all, you know, the funny thing is about this, Scott, when I get these letters, these emails, or when I talk to people on radio shows, everyone has a story. And the story isn't, I lived really high on the hog and now I'm paying the price. The story is, I had a financial emergency. The story is, I had a divorce. The story is, my spouse died. You know, those are the stories. The stories are that in this country, and I hope this is not true of most of the people in this room, most of whom I assume are extremely august, but I'm not. But so many of the people in this country, nearly half by the statistics, are living paycheck to paycheck because you don't save for a rainy day. As I say in the piece, we live within a storm. There's not an emergency every year. There's an emergency almost every day. My car won't work. My dog limps. You know, there's something that hits you on a daily basis, and you've got to pay for it. I've got a roof that needs repair. It's going to cost me $35,000. I'm not even insured for water damage. Where am I going to get $35,000 to repair that roof? You tell me. I have no idea.
And I should say here that Neal is being modest because he is august, and this is spelled out in the piece, but he is the author of 5, I believe,
5 books,
many of which were
one that came
successful.
out, what was published yesterday, I might add.
One of which was optioned by Martin Scorsese for Hollywood. I don't think it ever got made, but that, you know, provides some money. Was a television personality for some 5 years.
Yes. Longer even.
This is, you know, he is a man of great
and
accomplishments, which are
work
not commensurate with what he's earned.
Yeah, well, I won't say, I mean, I'm not going to speak to, I'll say this, because I think this speaks to the larger issue. I work 7 days a week. Last year, I wrote 30 pieces. 30 pieces and a book. 30 pieces and a book. And I taught, and I lecture, and I wrote a script, which was optioned. I did all of that. And even with all of that, even with, mortgage loan modification, it's tough to make ends meet. I make ends meet. I'm not saying I don't. I'm not in any greater debt. I'm paying off past debt. I'm not accumulating more. But it's tough to make ends meet. And this is something that a great deal of, the professional class in America doesn't get. They just don't get it. And I'm telling you here from a member of the professional class who works his butt off every single day of the year. There are no days off for me. That's literally true. I'm not speaking, in hyperbole. It's literally true. And I barely make ends meet. I do, but I barely make ends meet. That's the country in which we live. And it's a country in which half Americans can't afford the basics of a middle-class life. Are they angry? Yes. Can they voice it? You know how they voice it? By blaming China, by blaming Mexico, by blaming Obama, because in financial impotence, you don't talk about your impotence. And in America, we don't talk about these things. Well, I'm talking about it. I'm ashamed of it. I'm humiliated. But I felt, as I said earlier, that I could make some small contribution, some very small contribution, provide some very small solace by telling my story, because other people don't feel that they can tell theirs.
Well, and this is, actually, I won't even ask you to answer this, because this could become the segment of a whole separate, not only panel, but two-day summit on the state of media and content generation. One critique has been you chose to be a writer, and
it's true.
You were a very successful one. The economics of that have become more and more challenging as we and many of my colleagues live every day. But let me, and then I wanted to talk about some of the many, I have a sheaf here of positive comments here. But I'm actually not going to get into them because I don't think we have time. But stories about people who, and as you were saying, sometimes it's a spouse who dies, sometimes it's an unforeseen illness, sometimes it's literally just bad timing of a decision. Again, someone who chooses, following the advice of what everyone tells them, to leave their career in 2008 and then and move to Florida, and then the economy falls apart, and they can't find another job and end up moving in.
Yeah. Sometimes it's a great recession. It's a lot of little things, but sometimes it's a big thing that wipes out your net worth, so you've got nothing. And I've had people call me and write me about that. But this began before the Great Recession. I mean, the Great Recession obviously accelerated.
When did it begin? I mean, is this 1973? Is it?
Well, I mean, we know we've had wage stagnation since the late 70s, but I mean, the economists, I'm not an economist, and I don't even profess to begin to have any expertise, or I wouldn't be in this situation. I'm an ignoramus. But I mean, economists that I talked to said, in the early 80s, we started seeing the harbingers of this situation. And, wage stagnation is a perfect, look, I work in the gig economy. I work from piece to piece, or I sign a book. But for a writer today, I'm making the exact same money for a piece, and I write for some pretty big magazines, including Atlantic, that I made 20, 25 years ago. Adjust that for inflation, and you're seeing, that's my wage stagnation. My wage stagnation is nobody's paying any more than they paid 20 or 25 years ago. Now, that's part of being a writer. It's a terrible profession. You do it because it's an addiction, not because it's a profession. I'm addicted to it, as most writers are. But then you translate that into other people who are working in a factory or working in a service job or whatever, and they're not making any more money. But their expenses are going up. Their expenses are going up, and their incomes are not going up. And that's where the rubber meets the road.
Well, and so, translating this now to what this means for the larger economy, you have a great quote, and I'm going to bastardize it. I can't remember if it's a friend of yours or a New Yorker cartoonist or somebody who said, or maybe an actual New Yorker cartoon, but said, it used to be that life had, we would do what's called consumption smoothing. We all go through our careers, and there are times when you have greater or lesser income, and you smooth your purchasing accordingly. And the quote was, it used to be that we would go through rough patches, but now the rough patches have become constant.
Yeah, that was Bruce Eric Kaplan, cartoon in the New Yorker. We thought it was just a rough patch. It turned out to be our life. And that's how I conclude the piece, saying, we think we're going through a rough patch. Well, guess what? I hope for no one in this room, but for me, it's my life. And for probably half of America, roughly half of America, it's not a rough patch. It's their life. Are their wages going to skyrocket next year or 10 years from now? Are magazines suddenly going to start paying me more money? I can guarantee you they won't. Are publishers going to pay me more for my next book? No, they're not going to pay me any more. And again, translate that into the man or woman who's teaching, now that there are, unions are being destroyed and there's no leverage, or the person who's selling, or the person who's working in a factory. Are their wages going to skyrocket so that they can meet their expenses? No. It's now cosmic. We live in a rough patch. It's our life. And I talk about impotence. There's Viagra for sexual impotence, but there's no Viagra for financial impotence. There's struggle, and there's work, and there's hope, but the hope decreases. And I can tell you that too.
So you say correctly that you're not an economist. You talk to a lot of economists, though, for this piece.
I did.
And
some of them I think are in this room, and they're extremely helpful, and I thank them.
If the reality is in fact that life is now, for many of us, at least 47% of us, if not, I'll say, many of my colleagues at the magazine related powerfully to your piece, because if it's not their situation exactly, they realize how close they are. What do economists say about A, how we got here, and B, how do we get out of it? How much of it is the decline of union power? How much of it is globalization and offshoring? How much of it is just the gigification of the economy? How much of it is, we've talked about this in other, the sort of hardening of capitalism into treating labor as ever more disposable? What's the explanation for what caused it, and how do we get out of it? And can we get out of it?
Well, I'd be speaking outside my expertise, and I can't pretend, in a room of experts, I don't want to really speak outside my expertise. I know that the people I spoke with, many people talk about credit and the availability of credit and how people began to swim in credit because, the credit merchants were a little like and anticipated the mortgage merchants of subprime mortgages. But that's not the whole story. And even the economists that I talk to would say that's not the whole story. And even wage stagnation is not the whole story. And there are many things that feed into wage stagnation. So there are a number of factors. I can speak to the result because I am the result. I'm a living antidote. But there are so many different things that collaborate to cause something of this magnitude. And again, I've got to emphasize the magnitude is stupendous. And one of the reasons I think the piece is getting the response it's getting is because the magnitude has not been addressed, number one, and that people, as I said earlier, don't feel comfortable about expressing it. And when you put those two things together, what do you get? I think you get our political situation. You get a lot of angry, frustrated people who are displacing their resentments and their frustrations on a host of other things that aren't really the issue. But if we live in a rough patch economically, we live in an angry patch politically. And people just don't know how to articulate or don't feel comfortable articulating what it is that may really be peeving them.
Well, the anger clearly emanates to some degree from the economic anxiety.
Yes.
I want to make sure we leave time for questions at the end, but let me come back again to what we were talking about at the beginning, which is the shame, and you're bravely coming forward. And you say in your piece, as I said, people were more comfortable talking about, erectile dysfunction, but you hadn't even told, your closest friends, and now here you are putting it in a national magazine.
I did.
And I'm curious, what do you think that shame emanates from, and what has been the response from your friends? And should we start a Kickstarter campaign like right now to fund Neal's next book?
Please no, please no. The one thing I ask for no sympathy, no pity, none of that. This is my situation. I got myself into it. I say it in the piece a number of times. People don't always read it carefully enough, and they say, well, he's asking for this, that, or the other thing. Look, I have a lot better than probably most people in this country, because I do have a shred of hope that I'll get a bigger advance for the next book, or I'll get more work, or something will happen. And I hang on to that, and sometimes it's well-placed and sometimes it's misplaced. But I'm in a better situation than most of my fellow Americans.
And what's the source of the shame, though? Why are people, is this a distinctively American thing?
I believe it is, and I'll tell you, I mean, surveys show, and I'm sure people in this room know it, you know, Americans always, first of all, we live in a winner and loser country. So let's begin there. We have a political candidate who's divided the country into winners and losers, and believe me, he didn't have to do that because most of us think that way. Whether we like it or not, we think we're either a loser or we're a winner. And how do we determine those things? We determine winning and losing by how much money we make. I mean, this is a conspicuous consumption country. And nobody wants to be on the losing side of the divide, which is one of the reasons why it's so shameful. So, you know, I mean, I think, you know, it sort of begins there. You don't talk about it because to do it means that you're responsible. And this is the country, I was just about to say, in terms of surveys. If you look at surveys of Germany or England or France or other industrialized countries, a much, much smaller percentage of people will answer the question, you know, are you responsible for any financial difficulties that you are suffering? A much smaller percentage will answer yes than Americans. Americans have always believed, and they've been, frankly, taught to believe, that it's all on you. If you're having financial difficulty, it is completely your fault, because anybody can make it in this country if you work hard enough, right? Well, I'm going to tell you right now, and I'm resentful about this, and if I sound angry, I am angry. You can't work harder than I work, and it's not true. And you want to know something? If you talk to tens of millions of Americans who work hard and don't live above their means, it's not true. And it's about time we kind of deprogram ourselves to believe that, oh, if we only work hard, we'll get everything we want. We'll have that middle-class existence. It's not true. And I'm living evidence of that as well.
Well, that's a powerful note to end on and kind of set up for future panelists to talk about. But I want to leave a little bit of time for questions, so we can have 2 or 3 if they're very, very quick. So how about right there? You, ma'am.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Shelley Porgas, co-founder of Entrepreneurs for Hillary. You framed this conversation as, you know, financial impotence as compared to sexual impotence and whatever, suggesting almost that it's a male thing.
No.
And yet we know that women live at much lower, you know, economic levels in the country. So of the 47% that you cited who are living, you know, under the median, how many, you know, what proportion of those are female, either heads of households or individuals?
That's a great question. And let me just address it generally. You know, I call it financial impotence because I think it gives a handle on the issue, but you raise a very important issue. This is a malady, and I say this in the piece, that cuts across almost every demographic. Obviously, you know, male and female, you know, race, although Hispanics and blacks suffer much, much more from our economic dysfunction than a person like myself. But here's the interesting thing. It cuts across education, I also ought to add, but it also cuts across economic strata. If you look at the data shows that people who would by any standard be regarded as, say, upper middle class, I mean, Anna Maria Lusardi did a study with several of her colleagues. I hope she's in this room. She was extremely helpful to me and is doing very valuable work that showed that 1/4 of people who made between $100,000 and $150,000 could not afford a $2,000 emergency. So this is something that hits a very broad swath of Americans. And do women suffer? They suffer more than men. More than men. So you are absolutely right.
We're out of time, but there are so many hands up. If you can keep your question to 10 seconds or less, and you keep your answer to 30 seconds or less, we'll get one more in. So have it right there with the piece of paper in the air.
Yeah, my name is Li Yang. Thanks for your presentation, and your openness is grateful. I think that's what we as this society need. But I wonder if you have any research or data that you can tell. Today we are talking about economy, but if there's no liberty or justice, economy will not grow because all your assets will be taken away, whether you're individual or business. So without that capital or asset, economy just will not grow. So all conflict information or data research will become meaningless. So I just wonder if you can have those information that can really share with us, because we know a lot of people are struggling. I have a dream, and I think I can make it. I can be a billionaire. I have a vacation with my family almost every year. I plan. But now all those dreams are just bubbles.
Well, thank you. So I guess the boiled down, without broader social justice, liberty, can you, can she, can we all, how do we get so we can have, this sounds trivial, but, get so that we have an economy where Americans can have vacations and other things?
Well, that's beyond my pay grade.
All right.
That's in your pay grade. I've told you
So we'll leave that to the rest of you to figure that
exactly
out.
Exactly right.
Thank you very much. And thank you to Neal.
Thank you.